This is the most terrifying prison in the entire universe. The most vicious criminals in existence have all gathered here. From old men hundreds of years old to children barely a few years old. This place makes no distinction between men and women, humans and beasts, or even faith itself. But that blind old man is the one exception. He clearly has the power to slaughter his way through the entire prison. Yet he willingly stayed locked inside for a full 64 years. What no one realizes is that this was merely part of a deal between him and the warden. And now, he has only 2 years left. In the vast depths of cosmic space stands the most dreadful prison in the universe, the solitude of Karizman. A blind old man has just finished a full month of solitary confinement and is about to be transferred into a new cell. His only companions have been the nameless beetles that occasionally crawled inside. The old man takes a bite and cannot help but mutter, "Too bitter." Right after that, the cell door slowly creaks open. The guard urges him to move. But the strange part is that the guard should have been the one leading the way. And yet the whole situation is reversed, with the guard following behind the blind old man wrapped in bandages. He walks forward in a daze. He still cannot understand why his seniors warned him again and again never to provoke this blind old man. The man cannot see a thing, yet he can still find the right direction through these prison corridors with perfect accuracy, even though he only walks them once a month, as if darkness has never been an obstacle to him. Before reaching the new cell, the old man calmly turns his head and reminds the guard to be careful on the way back. The guard's lounge is extremely far from here, and returning alone is not safe. Once the old man steps into the new cell, the guard immediately reports to headquarters. Transfer of solitary cell 982 completed. My current location is 6 requesting the return route. The moment the old man enters the new prison block, he notices how unnaturally empty it feels. The inmates realize a newcomer has arrived, and after seeing that it is only an elderly man, they all breathe a sigh of relief. Some even secretly celebrate, thinking they will not have to throw down this time. Because they all know one thing. Most prisoners locked in this area are first-level offenders, and even the strongest among them are only second-level at best, the very bottom tier of the solitude prison. In a place ruled by the law of the jungle, someone like that old man poses absolutely no threat in their eyes. But no one notices that this silent, blind elder merely takes a light sniff, and instantly senses a presence in the air unlike the others. Deep down, he already knows the days ahead will be anything but peaceful. As a burst of golden light flares up, the inmates instantly realize that it is mealtime. The entire place erupts at once. Food is the rarest thing here, and the one prize everyone goes craziest for. But what gets served is still the same revolting maggot porridge. Even so, it remains something everyone fights over like mad. A second-level criminal named Tommy and his crew act with absolute arrogance. They monopolize the food, waste it however they please, and bark at anyone reckless enough to come near. The bottom feeders can only swallow their anger and pray that at least a few scraps might be left behind. The old man slowly walks toward the food barrel, wanting nothing more than a bowl of porridge to fill his stomach. But before he can get close, one of Tommy's lackeys barks at him and throws out the prison's savage rule. If you are not part of their group, then even old men and children have no right to eat. The man even hurls insults at him, mocking the old man as a useless piece of trash who only wandered over by following the smell. Then he shoves him roughly. A moment later, he even clamps a hand around the old man's throat. But in the next second, something shocking happens. The blind old man, who looked utterly defenseless, makes one casual move, and the arrogant criminal instantly lets out a shrill scream. In the moment his body flips through the air, he suddenly becomes blind as well. The surrounding inmates are completely stunned. No one saw what just happened. All they know is that this blind old man in front of them is terrifyingly strange. Tommy instantly flies into a rage and roars that the old man must be seized and punished. Then the scene shifts, and the old man's horrifying past is peeled back layer by layer. Some guards once wondered how he could withstand the cruelest punishment in the prison and even survive 30 days of solitary confinement without a problem. But their superior told them that if all he had done was kill one insignificant prisoner, then in a prison where thousands die every day, it would not even be worth mentioning. But the real truth is enough to send chills down anyone's spine. This blind old man, in a single night, slaughtered every prisoner inside an entire cell block. 241 dead, not a single survivor. And the old man's number is 51, which means he was the 51st prisoner ever brought here. And among countless criminals, he is the only legend still alive, His name is Ager Lastos, and he has already spent a full 64 years inside this prison. But what the guards never expected was that the same scene was playing out inside the cell again. The old man was still absurdly fierce, and the inmates, both enraged and terrified, grabbed whatever they could, rushed him all at once, surrounded him, and screamed that they were going to kill him. Someone caught sight of the blade-like object in the old man's hand and was so horrified that he nearly lost his soul on the spot. But even while facing a siege from dozens of men, the old man remained calm, moving so fast that no one could even catch a trace of it. In just a few moments, everyone who had rushed him was already lying on the ground. What broke them even more was that not a single one of those men had died. They had simply lost all ability to resist. Working up his courage, Tommy demanded to know who the old man really was. The old man only replied coldly that numbers had never been the same thing as power. People like them, who had no real ability at all, would die in this prison within a month or two at most. If they were tired of living, they were welcome to keep provoking him. After dealing with the trouble, Ager finally got to take a bite of food. Even disgusting maggot porridge was far better than being locked in solitary with barely any basic food at all. This prison called Solitude was built on countless brutal rules and systems. Any criminal who managed to survive here was no simple person, and this blind old man stood at the very peak of danger among them. Inside the cell was a young man named Ciro, and he unexpectedly sensed the unusual aura coming from the old man. What frightened him even more was that the old man instantly saw through the child at his side and realized that the boy carried an extremely precious bloodline. Ciro was both alarmed and furious, threatening the old man not to reveal that secret, or he would make sure he died without a burial place. But the old man only found it amusing. He had lived for far too long to care about such trivial matters anymore. He simply admitted that it had been a long time since he had met someone so unusual. He only wanted to make a friend and had no intention of exposing the child's secret. At that moment, the inmates who had gone out to gather food returned to the cell. Among them was the rhinoceros beastman Monrock, the sea eagle beastman Horik, and the beastman Guku. The moment the three of them entered and saw the blood all over the floor, rage exploded inside them. They had just returned from hard labor, only to find that the cell, which had once been relatively calm, had turned into a complete mess, and they immediately roared for the one responsible to come out. The old man calmly stepped forward and stated his name, Ager. When Monrock saw that he was nothing more than an unremarkable old man, he did not take him seriously at all and immediately began mocking him. He was even about to strike him on the spot, but Horik desperately stopped him. The moment Horik sensed the old man's overwhelming presence, he immediately realized this was not someone they could afford to provoke. So he quickly apologized and said they had meant no offense and only wished to coexist in peace. Ager could not be bothered to argue with them anyway. As long as no one took the initiative to provoke him, he had no interest in causing trouble for no reason. But that brief moment of peace was soon shattered. The instant bedtime arrived, the prison immediately activated its gravity system. This was one of the 4 great horrors of Solitude Prison. By relying on gravity devices implanted inside the inmates' bodies, it forcibly pinned every prisoner flat on the ground, making it impossible for them to get up. Any attempt to resist was met with a lethal electric shock. All the inmates could do was grit their teeth in silence and lie obediently on the icy floor, enduring that suffocating pressure. Monrock was still full of resentment and could not help asking Horik why he had stopped him from dealing with some old man. But Horik's next words made his face turn deathly pale in an instant. Horik had clearly seen the number on the old man's neck, 51. This prison held more than 2,000 criminals, and every one of them was assigned a number based on the order in which they entered. And being number 51 meant that the old man had most likely been in prison here when the prison itself was first established. He did not carry some low-level classification like first tier or second tier. He bore only a single number, one that represented seniority and terror. No one knew how long he had truly been here. Monrock was so frightened that he nearly lost his soul and even wanted to apologize immediately, while Horik could only comfort him in a low voice, saying that Ager did not seem like the kind of person who held grudges. But the moment those words left his mouth, a blood-curdling scream suddenly rang out from deep inside the cell block. Countless inmates had somehow turned into zombies, and the ones still alive scattered in terror, crying and screaming for help as the already oppressive cell block instantly turned into a living hell. The deafening chaos also woke Ager, who had been resting with his eyes closed. He frowned impatiently and sneered to himself, wondering who, during the time he had been locked in solitary confinement, had dared to open the gate to the maximum security block and release these troublesome things. The cell block, which had only just regained a little calm, plunged completely into unprecedented chaos. Ager slowly sat up, and the gravity device immediately discharged electricity through his body. At that moment, he understood there would be no peaceful sleep for him tonight. The zombies had appeared without the slightest warning. In the middle of the chaos, a man hurriedly told Zero to crawl behind the rocks and hide there. The man no longer had the luxury to think about anything else. Even if it cost him his life, he was going to protect Zero. Everyone scrambled to fight back, roaring as they tried to put the zombies down. That man also beast transformed in an instant, but the zombies only kept multiplying. No matter how many they killed, there seemed to be no end. At this moment, the beast men in the prison still possessed a natural racial advantage, so they could at least barely endure the anti-standing system. But the ordinary inmates had almost no power to resist. If this continued, every last one of them would eventually become zombies. What was even harder to understand was that the zombies could completely ignore the anti-standing system and remain standing the whole time. Only when someone suddenly came to their senses did they realize that these creatures had never been under the system's control in the first place. And that realization only deepened everyone's despair. Before one wave could even settle, another followed behind it, as a fresh horde of zombies came surging in again. The relentless suppression of the anti-standing system pushed everyone's stamina to the brink of collapse. Surrounded on all sides with no way out, everyone believed this time they were doomed for certain. At that moment, Ager suddenly stepped in. Electricity was bursting all over his body as he slammed straight into the zombie horde. To him, those zombies were nothing more than wheat in a field, cut down wave after wave. In his eyes, they were basically motionless watermelons standing there waiting to be smashed. That absurd level of strength instantly stunned everyone, and they could barely believe what they were seeing. Ager glanced at Monrock and Horuk and said calmly, "Good thing neither of you was bitten by the bloodthirsty zombie fleas." The two of them dropped to the ground in fright and hurriedly asked why he had saved them. Ager only answered flatly that he simply did not want things to become even more troublesome. After all, beastmen were already far stronger than ordinary inmates, and if they turned into zombies, they would be far harder to deal with. That was the real reason he stepped in. But before his words had even settled, the beastman Goku suddenly mutated into a zombie as well. Ager let out a light sigh, regretting that he had ultimately failed to save him, then remarked that it had been a long time since he had fought a beastman. But in the very next second, Ager made his move and immediately bled Goku out. Even though he was blind, his movements remained swift and precise, and he effortlessly dodged every single attack. Horuk felt that the whole scene was downright ridiculous, but that only made Ager's composure in battle stand out even more. Even the gravity system barely affected him at all. In the middle of the chaos, Goku transformed into a Doberman-like beast. But in Ager's eyes, even taking on a beast form changed nothing. If anything, the larger body only exposed more weaknesses. Watching this, a powerful thought suddenly rose in Horuk's heart. If he wanted to survive in this prison called solitude, then the only path was to follow the man standing before him, Ager. Everyone else was still gritting their teeth and struggling against the zombies when Ager suddenly turned around as if he were about to leave, and Horuk hurriedly called out to stop him. But in the very next second, Ager plunged straight into the zombie horde on the other side. With thunderous force, he wiped them all out. That move completely shocked everyone, leaving them even more shaken and more curious than ever about the old man's true identity. Not long after that, the prison's morning headcount began. Out of a cell block that once held 94 inmates, only 14 survived. A full 80 had died in the zombie outbreak, and this cell block was soon going to receive new prisoners. When the newcomers were brought in and saw corpses scattered everywhere, they froze in total panic. But the survivors, after fighting through an entire night of bloodshed, were already beyond exhausted and had no strength left to care about the newcomers. They could only collapse where they were and catch their breath, and so the head count ended in a rushed and careless way. Everyone had assumed that once the infected zombies were dealt with, the bloodthirsty zombie fleas spreading the virus would disappear as well. But in the blink of an eye, they saw Ager walk straight toward the great gate deeper inside the prison. That door was never locked, yet no one had ever dared step through it, and Ager pushed it open with ease. Seeing this, some of the others immediately grew tempted and wanted to follow him. But Horuk shouted them down, warning that no one who had ever walked out through that door had come back alive. What hid in that corridor was far more terrifying than any of them could imagine, enough to wipe them all out without effort. When Ager entered the corridor and looked ahead, he found that the visitor was actually a goblin carrying an enormous pack on his back. The goblin even laughed and said that once Ager heard his voice, he knew he would come out to see him. That goblin was named Jacob, a graduate of the Academy of Fantasy Drama, known in the trade as the Evergreen of Manga. As the saying went, goblins are eternal, while the 2D world is just a revolving door. Jacob admitted that he had spent 5 gold coins to get Ager's whereabouts from the guard hogs. He grumbled that hogs had become greedier than ever, but still said that if it meant seeing the old man, that little cost was nothing worth mentioning. Ager bluntly pointed out that Jacob had come again for the prison map. Jacob admitted it right away. The prison had changed again 2 days ago, and its entire structure periodically underwent a complete reorganization, making it impossible for anyone to remember every route. Ager alone was the exception. By instinct alone, he could grasp the entire prison's layout, and that ability left Jacob sincerely full of admiration. Ager did not waste any more words. He quickly finished drawing the map. Jacob was overjoyed at once and immediately said he was willing to help the old man with anything he needed. Ager only asked one calm question, whether there was any normal food available. Jacob agreed right away. He even looked a little ashamed that all he could offer the old man in return was such simple food. During their conversation, Jacob also gave Ager one crucial piece of information. Every low-level cell block would experience a summoning today, and this time, the creatures being summoned were the most troublesome kind of all. Ager's heart sank slightly when he heard that, but he was still grateful for the warning. After all, these summonings never happened on a fixed schedule, and he had never been able to pin down the exact timing. Jacob then casually asked whether the old man had been bothered by those people lately. Once he heard that those troublemakers had been relatively quiet recently, he finally felt at ease enough to take his leave. Before parting, the two of them reminded each other to stay safe. After Jacob left, Ager fell into silent thought. The warden had deliberately arranged for him to be placed in this cell block, most likely for the sake of so-called merchandise protection, and that so-called merchandise was probably the child. But after thinking it over, he felt that this might not be such a bad thing after all, especially since his body was no longer what it used to be. The moment Ager returned to the cell block, a rich aroma of meat suddenly spread through the air. The surrounding inmates were instantly drawn in by that smell, and once they realized the meat was in Ager's hands, their eyes went red with greed on the spot. They shouted that they were going to take it, claiming that in prison there was no yours or mine, and whoever grabbed it first had the right to keep it. Just as the conflict was about to explode, Horik and Monrock suddenly stepped in and shouted everyone down. The two of them directly warned the entire crowd not to provoke Ager, or they would regret it. The once arrogant inmates were instantly intimidated and no longer dared make a move. Afterward, Ciro still could not hold back his curiosity and asked Ager where such precious food had come from. But Ager did not answer. He simply called them over and told them to eat while the meat was still hot. After the meal, Monrock took the initiative to thank Ager not only for the food, but also for saving them during the zombie chaos the night before. But Ager said bluntly that in this prison called Solitude, being alive was never something to be thankful for, because this place could turn life itself into a curse. And yet, from Monrock and the others, he could still feel that fierce desire to keep living. So he finally voiced the question in his heart. In a place as hellish as this, do they truly still want to keep living? Monrock and the others answered almost without hesitation, saying that the instinct to survive was part of being alive. But Ager asked again, what if one day, even that instinct itself started driving them toward death? Because this prison called Solitude would eventually make people long for death. He wanted to know whether, even when that day came, they would still insist on living. Their eyes were filled with resolve. Monrock said outright that he refused to die pointlessly in a place like this, while Ciro said the boy still wanted to make it home alive and see his father again. That determination finally made up Ager's mind. He told them that he was bound by a promise that had lasted 66 years, and now that the deadline was close, he needed more companions if he wanted to fulfill that goal. And with the prison summoning set to arrive today, everyone had to be ready. Soon after, the newly arrived inmates were forced to deal with the rotting corpses scattered throughout the prison. The reason was simple. Those bodies could easily trigger infectious disease, and the reeking stench of decay was enough to make everyone miserable. Some people could not help complaining, saying that it was only because they were too weak that they had to handle such filthy work. Others heard rumors that all these corpses had been made by a single old man, but they dismissed it as a joke unable to believe anyone could really be that terrifying. But just then, the atmosphere around them suddenly changed. In the next instant, a pile of living human heads appeared inside the cell block out of nowhere. Everyone immediately became alert and stumbled backward in fright. Horik quickly asked Ager if this was the summoning he had mentioned before. Ager calmly told them that these were merely the prison's cleaners. They existed to deal with trash and rotting corpses, and they were not considered dangerous creatures. But once attacked, they would become violently enraged. So he warned everyone to deal with them carefully. After things had settled down a little, Ager asked how the task he had assigned earlier was progressing. When he learned that everything had already been arranged and that everyone was still making preparations, he was clearly satisfied and called everyone back, telling them to get ready for whatever came next. On the way, some people were still shaken by the stench of the rotting corpses. Their companions could only comfort them by saying that if they wanted to stay alive in this prison, then they would have to get used to it sooner or later. But before those words had even faded, another disturbance spread through the area, and something else was summoned again. When everyone looked up, they were instantly overwhelmed by the creature before them. That was when they realized it was a fire salamander. The sudden disturbance erupting inside the cell block threw everyone into immediate panic. As flames surged everywhere, people screamed and scattered, and in the blink of an eye, half of them had already perished in the sea of fire. Only then did everyone fully realize that what had been summoned was a cursed fire salamander, one of the most troublesome beings possible. Faced with that overwhelming blaze, despair rose in every heart. Hiding behind a giant rock, Horik was drenched in cold sweat, and even his voice trembled as he spoke. "Old man, is that the summoned creature you were talking about? The fire salamander?" And yet, at this very moment, Ager alone remained completely calm. He told everyone not to panic. They had already made preparations in advance here, and as long as they followed his instructions exactly, they still had a chance to survive. The moment he finished speaking, the fire salamander lunged toward the group. Ager immediately warned them that the very next second after the fire salamander opened its mouth, it would unleash flames reaching 10 meters. The instant it showed itself, everyone had to get behind the rocks at once. Even if they got burned, that was still better than losing their lives. Most importantly, they had to keep their eyes locked on its head at all times. Only then did everyone finally realize that the stones inside the cell had already been moved and stacked into a defensive wall, barely holding back the flames. No one understood why the old man had prepared that in advance, but they were all grateful that this very wall had saved their lives. In the chaos, Monrock shouted that he wanted to switch positions with Horik, but Horik flatly refused. At that critical moment, Ciro suddenly noticed water dripping from the roof. Everyone immediately followed the old man's orders, mixing water with dirt into mud, then hurling it hard at the fire salamander the moment it let its guard down. None of them understood what the mud was supposed to do at first, and then the old man's voice rang out at just the right time. Even though the fire salamander is a monster, it still breathes through its skin. The mud would make it struggle to breathe and slow its movements, and it could even block its vision. As it turned out, the mud worked exactly as he said, and the fire salamander's assault was completely suppressed. Ager seized the opening and attacked at once, still ferocious as ever. It did not take long before he successfully subdued the terrifying monster. Deep down, everyone felt secretly relieved. If not for the old man's help, there was no way they could have survived in such a hopeless situation. As the fire salamander crashed to the ground, the crowd finally let out a breath, thinking the crisis was over at last, and some even began marveling at the strength of the old man and the beastmen. But to their shock, another mutation suddenly struck. A fresh wave of summoning ripples burst out, and the shrill noise made everyone's heart pound in fear. Someone screamed in terror, wondering if monsters like the fire salamander were about to appear again, cursing the hellish situation even as his face turned pale. Listening to the sound, Ager immediately judged that at least 10 monsters had just been summoned. Despair once again settled over the group, and no one could say for certain whether they would survive this time. A new round of slaughter was about to begin, yet Ager remained perfectly calm. He admitted that dealing with a fire salamander inside the cell itself was not actually that difficult, but right now, their surroundings had already turned into a complete sea of fire. Ciro was pushed behind the others for protection, while Horik quickly asked whether they should keep following the same method as before. But Ager shook his head and said bluntly that this time, it would be hard to keep everyone alive. The only option now was to move toward the corridor immediately. The moment he said that, everyone was thrown into shock. They all questioned him, because the old man had clearly said before that the corridor was even more dangerous than the cell block. So why was he now leading everyone out there anyway? But the old man offered no explanation. He simply charged out first. Horik hurriedly urged Monrock to stay sharp and follow, because at this point, staying by old man Ager's side was the safest option they had. Remembering that they absolutely did not want to die meaninglessly in this place. Everyone could only grit their teeth and follow. With Ager clearing the way in front, they fled desperately and finally managed to reach the corridor. But the heavy smoke made it impossible for anyone to see what lay ahead. And this place, even more dangerous than the cell block, filled them with dread. Ager once again warned everyone to stay alert, because that corridor might also be hiding other criminals, especially third-level and fourth-level offenders, and one wrong move could cost them their lives. Horik became even more afraid after hearing that, but he still volunteered to watch the rear. Ager agreed, but repeatedly reminded him that he absolutely could not lose the main group. But before they had gone very far, unease had already started creeping into Horik's heart. His instincts told him that something in the distance was watching them from the shadows, and he even began to wonder whether staying in that corridor was truly the right choice. In the very next second, Horik noticed something was wrong. He shouted in alarm that there really was something in the corridor and even wanted to urge everyone to retreat back to the cell. He kept calling out to the old man, but Ager gave no response at all, and that only made Horik's fear grow even stronger. In the chaos, Horik suddenly vanished. Monrock anxiously shouted his name, desperately trying to find him. Ager immediately stopped him and warned that countless dangers were lurking in the corridor. Yelling at a time like this would only attract even more terrifying things. Monrock was frantic, but in no more than a moment, Horik had already disappeared completely. Ager spoke slowly and told them that this corridor hid beings that could teleport like ghosts, and that within it were nearly all the horrifying creatures anyone could imagine. The moment Monrock recalled his own past experience, he believed every word the old man said. But because of that, he became even more despairing, because he no longer knew whether Horik could ever be found. Ager only said flatly that there was no need to worry about failing to find his little sparrow friend. The real problem was that, by the time they found him, he might already be nothing more than a cold corpse. Meanwhile, Horik himself had finally realized that this corridor seemed to have no end at all. No matter how far he ran, it felt impossible to escape. This place, built jointly by a grand mage of the universe and a genius architect, was filled with unknown dangers in every corner. One person accidentally became separated from the main group and was trapped alone in the corridor, where fear swallowed him whole in an instant. In the next second, he sensed that something was drawing near, and when he saw what it was, he let out a terrified scream, because it was a savage ogre. He knew perfectly well that he was no match for an ogre. If he wanted to survive, the only thing he could do was stay alert and run for his life. But the moment he turned around, he discovered that there was another ogre behind him as well. Trapped between them, he was driven straight into despair. Only one thought remained in his mind. If an ogre caught him, he would be torn to pieces in an instant. No matter what, he had to escape. He absolutely could not die meaninglessly in a place like this. But the ogres were far faster than he had imagined. In the end, he was still caught, and a tearing pain exploded through his body. He thought in despair about whether this was really how he was going to die, useless and meaningless. Summoning his very last bit of strength, he screamed for help, hoping someone might still come save him. But just when he thought death was certain, a thunderous crash rang out. The ogre was sent flying away with absurd ease. He lifted his head in confusion and saw that the one who had saved him was actually a pig-headed man. That figure moved with such clean and efficient precision that it looked like he was playing baseball. From a single to a triple, then a double play, and finally even a two-run home run. The whole sequence looked effortless, and just like that, the two ogres were wiped out. Horik stared at the pig-headed man before him, and a storm rose inside his heart. He almost instantly concluded that the other party had to be a fourth-level offender. If he wanted to live, then all he could do was beg desperately for mercy, because his life or death clearly depended entirely on the other man's mood. The pig-headed man looked at him in confusion and asked him twice why he still was not going back when the game was already over. But Horik only kept kneeling there and pleading for his life, begging him not to kill him. The pig-headed man looked even more baffled and even seemed worried that others might mistake him for some kind of murderer. Then he leaned in and sniffed, and his expression changed at once. In a harsh voice, he demanded to know who Horik was and why he carried the scent of that blind old man on him. He pressed Horik to answer immediately. Horik was so panicked that he blurted out a question of his own, asking whether the blind old man he met was Old Man Ager. But the moment those words left his mouth, another voice came from behind him. The newcomer called out the pig-headed man's name and scolded him for acting alone. That person glanced at the ogres lying on the ground and said in a calm tone that it seemed the gods had truly granted their blessing today, seeing how easily such dangerous ogres have been taken down. Quite impressive. Then he noticed Horik as well, and a puzzled expression crossed his face. Horik was completely dumbfounded because standing before him now were 4 4th-level offenders. Only then did Ager's earlier warning flash back into his mind, and he finally realized that the cell had indeed been the safer place all along. At that moment, Ager's nose twitched slightly. He motioned for everyone to move in carefully, then lowered his gaze toward what lay below. Following the old man's line of sight, the group instantly turned pale at what they saw. They hurriedly asked what that thing even was. For once, Ager's expression grew truly grave. He told them that creature was exceptionally vicious, capable of killing even 5th-level offenders with ease. Most of the horrors lurking in the corridor had names of their own, and this one was called Beheader. For a moment, no one understood what Beheader was supposed to mean. Only then did the old man explain slowly, because that creature's favorite thing to do was cut off its enemies' heads. He warned them again and again to be extremely careful. The moment Beheader appeared, it meant there was no safe zone left anywhere nearby. Fortunately, this group managed to narrowly avoid Beheader's search. As he recalled the near slaughter they had just escaped, Monrock still felt his scalp go numb and bluntly declared that he never wanted to set foot in the corridor again. Ager then asked whether he wanted to head back to the cell, but Monrock had his own principles. He refused to be a coward who abandoned his friends and ran, insisting on continuing the search. He still could not help feeling uneasy, so he asked Old Man Ager whether he knew which direction they should search. The old man merely reassured everyone in a calm voice, saying they would be reunited with Horik soon enough. Meanwhile, Horik had almost been strangled to death. The pig-headed man urgently questioned him about his relationship with the old man. Horik hurriedly explained that they were merely ordinary cellmates, but he was still harshly warned not to lie. That was because the pig-headed man had already sensed Ager's scent lingering on him. The moment those words were spoken, the others in the room also became tense to the extreme. Horik himself was left with only one thought in his mind: run. That suffocating fear in the room was so intense that even the others were infected by it and felt their hearts tighten. At that moment, someone named Kid said he wanted to talk to Horik, while another person warned him not to scare Horik even more. Fortunately, they quickly made it clear that they had no intention of harming him. At the same time, they told him that in this place called Solitude, countless eyes were always fixed on Old Man Ager. Anyone connected to him might not have enough lives to pay the price, even if they had dozens to spare. The ones watching him were monstrous beings that even these 4 did not dare look in the eye. That was why they repeatedly warned Horik to be extremely careful with everything he did from now on. After that, he had healed Horik's external injuries. He even recited a prayer to calm his mind. It was only after leaving that place that the group finally let out a breath of relief, secretly thankful that they had not run into Old Man Ager there. And once Horik had regained the ability to move, he once again stepped alone into the darkness to search for his companions. Just when despair was beginning to swallow him whole, the sound of footsteps in the distance suddenly reignited a spark of hope inside him. When he finally saw that it was Old Man Ager and Monrock's group, Horik was overwhelmed with shock and joy, blurting out, "You guys are actually still alive." He knew perfectly well that his bond with the others was not especially deep, and that they had no reason to risk their lives looking for him. When he learned that they had found him only because of Ager's guidance, Horik bowed deeply to thank the old man, while Monrock welcomed him back with a grin. Later, when the others learned that Horik had been healed by a 4th-level offender, and that this person was a believer of the Constellation of Light, they could not help but feel relieved that he had not instead run into one of the followers of the Dark Void Seat. But Zero could not understand what any of them were talking about. As it turned out, in this universe there existed 2 godlike forces, the Constellation of Light and the Dark Void Seat. And no matter which side a person believed in, they were almost always fanatical devotees. They firmly believed that their faith would secure the world awaiting them after death. And even within this prison called Solitude, the powers devoted to those divine beings had already split into different factions. The fact that Horik had survived that corridor filled with danger showed not only that he was lucky, but also that he had remarkable room to grow. And the fierce, almost stubborn will to survive within him had also been noticed by Old Man Ager. In his heart, the old man had already started planning how to forge his own fangs. As far as he was concerned, he had attempted this sort of thing more than once before, and as long as enough time was spent, it would not be difficult to achieve. But another concern still weighed heavily on his mind, because he knew all too well that the time left to him was running short. He did not even have time to voice that concern before danger came crashing down without warning. The moment a strange noise rang out, Ager made a snap decision and ordered everyone to run with all they had. In the next second, accompanied by a thunderous roar, Beheader revealed itself. Horik hurriedly demanded to know what that thing even was. And the instant he learned that it was a terrifying existence capable of easily killing even 5th-level offenders, he was instantly filled with regret, even ashamed that he had been trembling earlier from nothing more than fear of the ogres. But there was no time left for self-reflection. Beheader was closing in with every step, and if it caught them, death was certain, so everyone urgently turned to Old Man Ager for a way out. But the old man had already made up his mind. Since he had decided to take these people under his wing, he would absolutely not let them die here. He knew very well that Beheader's true target was him alone, and the only way to keep them safe was to separate from the group. Seeing that Beheader was about to catch up, the old man immediately gave the order, telling everyone to get into the narrow passage ahead at once. At first, the others thought the terrain of that passage might at least slow Beheader down, but the old man, his expression grave, told them that the real danger was only beginning. He called the sparrow over and ordered him to lead the others back to the cell through the next fork, following the sequence of left, right, and left, while he himself would lure Beheader away. After the sparrow accepted the order, the group moved at once. But no one expected Beheader to smash straight through the gate with brute force and force its way into the narrow passage. Watching Beheader chase after the old man, everyone was filled with dread. After Horik confirmed that Beheader had already been lured away by the old man, Monrock burned with frustration, feeling that this corridor was crawling with monsters this terrifying. Meanwhile, Ciro and Goad proposed going back to fight alongside the old man, unwilling to leave him behind alone like this. But that suggestion was rejected on the spot. Horik said bluntly that the years Old Man Ager had survived in solitude were far beyond anything they could compare to. If he had made it this far, then he must have already faced countless horrors before. And the reason he had chosen to lure Beheader away this time was precisely to keep the rest of them from getting killed. In the old man's eyes, they were nothing more than dead weight right now. Rather than going back and making things worse, the best thing they could do was follow his instructions and return safely to the cell as quickly as possible. Though unwilling, they could only force down their emotions and keep moving. Meanwhile, on the other side, Ager had been driven to the brink by Beheader's relentless pursuit. But unexpectedly, Beheader actually spoke, mocking him for already being short of breath and for the pain now creeping into his legs. It even sneered that perhaps it should simply cut his legs off for him, so he would no longer have to suffer. And while it was at it, he might as well say his last words. Ager's suspicion flared instantly, because the thing before him did not act like a mindless ghost at all. Ordinary horrors should not have been able to hold a conversation like this, much less remember him so clearly. In almost an instant, he concluded that someone he had met before had to be standing behind this Beheader, and that person was most likely Satyr. The moment those words fell, a familiar laugh drifted through the corridor. Then Satyr stepped out. He first marveled at the old man's sharpness, then asked with curiosity how exactly he had seen through the fact that all of this was Satyr's doing. But the old man only answered calmly, reminding him that he was blind to begin with. That last remark had merely been a casual test. He just had not expected that the man before him really would turn out to be Satyr, the necromancer aligned with the demon worshippers. 5 years had passed, and the little brat for back then had clearly grown up. He had even learned how to command horrors to come after him. Looking at Satyr, the old man spoke with absolute certainty and cold contempt, saying that even after 5 full years, the gap between Satyr and himself was still laughably wide. At that very moment, the control Beheader launched another savage attack at Ager. Yet in the old man's eyes, it was still nowhere near enough. But Satyr clearly had no intention of believing Ager's words. He arrogantly declared that after 5 whole years of bitter training, he had finally learned to control the corridor's horrors, and now he could even kill 5th-level offenders with ease. He even bragged that the old man had no chance of escaping today, and that he could either surrender obediently or kneel and submit beneath his rule. He boasted that these 5 years of cultivation were already enough to let him crush everything in his path. And yet, even though Beheader's attacks poured down like a storm, they still could not so much as touch the edge of Ager's clothes. Faced with that arrogance, Ager only spoke calmly, saying that he had already endured and held out inside this prison called Solitude for a full 64 years. Then he threw the question back at his opponent. What right did someone with only 5 years dare to have, putting his own 5 years on the same level as Ager's? Sater instantly flew into a rage at those words, only for Ager to expose the shallowness of his thinking, pointing out that he was hopelessly obsessed with ranks and levels. In truth, the battle itself had already made everything clear. Beheader had already had many of its limbs severed, and if a few more were cut away, it would be reduced to a limbless stump. Then Ager finally revealed his real skill. In a single instant, he forced the other side to truly understand the heaven and earth difference between them. He even saw through the mark being used to command the horrors. And in a cold voice, he told the other to carry a message back to the demon worshippers. All of their struggle was nothing but wasted effort. Just like that, the fearsome beheader disappeared into the far end of the corridor. Meanwhile, Horik's group was still struggling to find their way through the corridor, their hearts filled with worry. The thunderous noise they had heard earlier left them deeply uneasy, and they were terrified that something might have happened to Ager. It was not until Ciro spotted the glow of fire ahead that they finally saw Ager standing there completely unharmed. The whole group was stunned and overjoyed. None of them had expected that Ager had already gotten ahead of them. Ager told the others that the chaos inside the cell block had finally come to an end. Even though everyone was full of confusion, they soon learned that the fire salamanders had already finished hunting and left the cell block, scattering in every direction. All that remained behind were charred corpses. The old man then looked at Ciro and told him to start accepting the reality of solitude. Ciro had thought that the rule of survival here was simply that the weak were doomed to die. But Ager gave him a completely different answer. In solitude, anyone could die at any moment. Only then did the others truly grasp the nature of solitude. Every day, more than 1,000 criminals were thrown into this prison, and countless others died inside it. Level, personality, status, and ability meant nothing. Death was always there, shadowing everyone, while darkness covered every corpse. Life was often snuffed out in an instant, without the slightest chance to resist. That was how the prison's system worked. It kept killing inmates, then replacing them with new ones, over and over again. Not long after that, the morning head count began. Out of a cell block that had once held 95 inmates, 90 of them were dead, and only 5 survivors remained. Because the numbers had fallen too low, those 5 were soon informed that they would be reassigned to a different cell block. That news left all of them shaken. Before the transfer happened, Ager urgently warned them that once they were reassigned, they would most likely be forcibly separated. He also specifically reminded them that after a reassignment, something called release and opening would often occur. If any of them were sent into the jungle sector, they had to run toward the sea, no matter what. That only left them even more confused. None of them could understand how a prison like this could possibly contain a jungle. But amid the confusion, they were indeed separated. Ager was assigned to cell block 3498, and only Ciro remained by his side. He could not help feeling some regret. The companions he had taken a liking to, the ones he thought were worth taking under his wing, had now been split away from him. At the same time, however, he instantly saw through the warden's intention. The man clearly wanted to force him to focus all of his attention on molding Ciro. To put it bluntly, he wanted Ager to properly manage this piece of merchandise. Before meeting the warden again, Ager had already decided to train Ciro well and use that in exchange for what he truly wanted. After all, no one understood better than Ager himself that the time left to him was running short. After arriving at the new cell block, Ager told Ciro that this one covered roughly 2,000 square meters, 4 times the size of their previous one. Judging from the echoes, there were probably close to 300 inmates inside. The appearance of the two of them quickly drew the attention of the other prisoners. Some saw an old man and a young boy and instantly gave rise to ugly intentions. Some even openly declared that they wanted to take the old man as a slave. Others stared at Ciro's body and bluntly said that he looked like he would taste good. Ciro was terrified and immediately cried out to Ager for help. But just then, a prisoner named Razna suddenly stepped forward. She scolded the others for being too greedy and openly declared that Ciro belonged to her. After driving the others back with arrogant authority, she ordered her men to bring Ciro over. Ciro struggled desperately, crying and calling out to Ager for help. He simply could not understand why the old man was acting as though none of this had anything to do with him. Just as Ciro was being dragged away by force, his body suddenly began to convulse violently without control. When Rosna saw that, she immediately cursed her men for being useless and assumed they had messed something up while handling him. But deep down, Ager actually felt a flicker of anticipation because he was finally about to witness the true value of the merchandise the warden had spoken of. He watched Ciro's convulsing body with cold eyes and deliberately chose not to step in right away, wanting to see just how much potential the boy could really unleash. As for Rosna, when she saw the boy suddenly turn violent, she found it amusing and immediately ordered her men to subdue Ciro. His subordinates rushed forward at once, trying to pin Ciro down by force. But as Ciro struggled with everything he had, he actually turned the tables and suppressed them instead. That immediately infuriated the man making the move. Yet for certain reasons, he could not simply kill the boy outright. So all he could do was keep trying to force Ciro into submission. But Ciro continued resisting with everything he had. That only made another inmate even angrier. He stepped forward and slapped the man across the face, openly berating him for not even being able to restrain a child, leaving the subordinate too frightened to even breathe loudly. But right in the middle of that struggle, Ager suddenly stepped in and blocked their path. The moment Rosna's men saw him, they shouted furiously, "An old man like you really has some nerve. Get lost already." Ager simply flicked his arm, and in the next instant, several of them were already sprawled across the ground. Ager lowered his eyes to the unconscious Ciro. Even if the boy still was not strong enough to defeat a second-level offender, the old man still judged his talent to be outstanding and worth cultivating. Rosna instantly felt that Ager was courting death, but Ager remained completely calm and said lightly that, at his age, there was nothing left for him to fear except the messenger of the underworld. That line utterly enraged Rosna. She immediately swore that she would bind the old man's arms and legs, then whip him bit by bit, until he beat him to death without the slightest mercy. But just as the situation reached its most dangerous point, Magan suddenly appeared and stopped Rosna in time. Rosna immediately snapped that the boy and the old man were her prey first, and that Magan had better stay out of it. Naturally, Magan refused to back down. The two sides confronted each other head-on, each declaring they were ready to fight at any moment, and the tension instantly tightened to the extreme. But in the very next second, a dense swarm of square heads suddenly appeared, and Rosna had no choice but to give up for the moment. Even Ager was a little puzzled as to why Magan had stepped in to help him. Magan immediately walked forward and made his intentions clear. He confessed that a year ago, the old man had once saved his life in the jungle. Even if the old man no longer remembered it now, he had never forgotten that debt and was even willing to follow him from then on. He even ordered his men on the spot to address the old man as boss from now on. Ager could only feel helpless about it, thinking that he had long passed the age of being called boss. At that moment, Ciro jolted awake in bed. His dreams had been filled with scenes of himself being bullied and humiliated. By then, Ager had already brought Ciro to cell block 3498. At the same time, Magan began explaining the situation here to Ager. This area was divided into three major factions. The first was Magan's faction, led by Magan himself. The second was Rosna's faction, which fought with whips. And the third belonged to the swordsman Bikan. All three leaders were third-level offenders, and the three sides kept each other in check, maintaining a fragile balance. In this chaotic place, the factions were sharply divided, and Bikan's men were especially arrogant, openly belittling the low-tier first-level offenders and treating them like insects beneath their feet. And yet, despite seeming hostile toward the other factions, Bikan took the initiative to share food and spoils after returning from the hunt. Ager thanked Magan for the information and said that he needed to rest for now, telling him to leave first. As for Ciro, he was overwhelmed with guilt over being weak and getting bullied. He even felt that Ager had only turned a blind eye to his suffering because he was too useless. But Ager gently reassured him. He told Ciro that whether someone was strong or weak was never defined by themselves, but rather by the opponent standing in front of them. He could already see that Ciro possessed remarkable talent. Even though he had lost the memory of that brief awakening, he was still someone worth cultivating. That was why Ager was willing to teach him how to drive out the darkness in his heart and truly become stronger. At the same time, Ager told the boy that no one could grow stronger on an empty stomach. If he wanted strength, he first had to eat properly. But he also warned Ciro in a serious voice that even if surviving here meant living off monsters and insects, he must never become like those people who had lost all humanity and would do anything just to stay alive. Those words made Ciro firm up his resolve completely. He had to become stronger and never be anyone's burden again. He only hoped that one day he could survive in this cruel place with his own strength, until the day he reunited with his brother, Lucas. At the same time, the prison was about to begin its release phase, and every faction had started searching everywhere for people they could use. Elsewhere, Rosna was reporting the situation to his demon guide. In the middle of his report, he casually mentioned that a long-haired old man with bandages over his eyes, along with a child, had recently been sent here. The moment the demon guide heard the description of the old man, his expression changed dramatically, and he immediately decided to go in person. Rosna eagerly volunteered to capture Ager first, determined to offer this seemingly ordinary old man as prey to his superior. But the demon guide looked at him with utter disdain and mocked him, saying he simply was not capable of it. Even so, he still did not stop Rosna from trying. Meanwhile, Ager did not do what Ciro expected and teach him any kind of martial arts or fighting techniques. Instead, he told Ciro that those outward forms were completely useless to him. What he truly needed to master was an entirely different kind of power. So Ager told Ciro to steady his breathing and focus all of his attention on the darkness before him, preparing to guide him into his own inner world. Following Ager's instructions, Ciro passed through a brief moment of dizziness, and then suddenly found himself standing in a strange world of darkness. Panic instantly took hold of him, and he cried out loudly for the old man, his heart filling with fear. But just then, Ager's voice sounded beside him, calmly soothing him. Ager told Ciro that this was his inner world, and if he truly wanted to grow stronger, he would first have to understand and accept the darkness hidden deep inside it. This was the first time Ciro had ever faced the shadows in his own heart so directly. Ager told him to try taking one step forward and warned him not to look down at the ground, only to keep his breathing steady. Ciro endured the dizziness and unease gnawing at his mind, and forced himself to follow Ager's instructions. In the end, he barely completed the trial while standing on the very edge of collapse. Looking at the still shaken Ciro, Ager calmly pointed out a fact. The bloodline flowing through his body was his strongest and most fundamental weapon. Before long, mealtime arrived, but there was no such thing as normal food here, and what Magan brought them was nothing more than roasted monster meat. Ciro lowered his head and looked at the meat in his hands, unable to stop himself from worrying about those who had no food at all. But Ager calmly told him that relying only on hunting in the corridor was nowhere near enough to keep everyone alive. Naturally, those people had their own ways of surviving, and very soon, Ciro saw the cruelest truth of this place with his own eyes. A group of people were forcibly confiscating supplies, and were even treating the companions who had died during the hunt as food and bargaining goods to be divided and traded. Even more disgusting, they were actually cheering over it, preparing to hold some so-called meat feast. A violent wave of nausea instantly surged through Ciro, making him gag on the spot. Ager immediately stopped him and said that vomiting would only damage his body even further. Magan then told him that the reason Beacon had not openly started a large-scale conflict was not because he lacked the nerve, but because his ambitions were even bigger. He wanted to bring everyone here under his control and make them all his subordinates. Beacon took the initiative and asked to meet Ager face-to-face. Ager agreed to go and told Ciro to head back alone. Magan also said he would send 2 men to protect Ciro, but that so-called protection was hiding murderous intent from the start. The 2 subordinates assigned to watch Ciro were already full of resentment. They envied the others for getting to enjoy the food Beacon had brought back while they were stuck guarding a brat. Not only did they have no intention of protecting him, they even began entertaining ugly thoughts. Ciro was young, and to them, that meant tender meat. The only reason they did not act immediately was because they feared punishment from their captain and dreaded being handed over to Rosna as food. Left behind on his own, Ciro fell completely into confusion. He had no idea whether he could ever become as strong as the old man. Faced with Ciro's endless curiosity back then, Ager had been unusually patient and had answered nearly every question he asked. Ciro had been amazed by Ager's monstrous strength and had even begun to wonder whether he was human at all. But Ager had only smiled and admitted that he was, in fact, just an ordinary human. He could not use magic, but he could control another kind of energy that had only made Ciro admire him even more. As he kept asking questions, Ciro had also learned that Ager was already 88 years old. He had no special hobbies and only took walks in the corridor whenever he could not sleep. He also had 2 close friends with completely opposite personalities. And when Ciro had finally asked why the old man had come to this place called Solitude, Ager's tone had grown unusually heavy. He had said that he came here because his wife, a woman with great beauty and a warm smile, had already passed away. But before he could even finish those words, a sudden strange noise violently pulled Ciro back to reality. Accompanied by the sharp crack of a whip, an unwelcome guest burst through the door. Rosna's original target had been the old man, but after sweeping her gaze across the room, she found only Ciro there alone. She immediately mocked him, comparing him to a little dog with no one left to protect it. With no ability to defend himself, Ciro was instantly pushed into a corner. He had no one to rely on, and as the enemy advanced step by step, he sank completely into helplessness and panic, unable to think of any way out. Trembling all over, Ciro begged her not to come any closer. At the sight of that, Rosna burst into loud laughter. She treated Ciro like a new pet and beat him at will. She even remarked that his toughness seemed decent, and that he would probably last longer than the pets she had already toyed to death. Under that crushing pressure, Ciro could only lower his head in pain. Even so, he still used every bit of strength he had left to warn Rosna that if she truly laid a hand on him, she would bring disaster upon herself. But Rosna dismissed that completely. With scorn, she mocked Ciro as nothing more than a useless coward who could only tremble and roll back his eyes. Growing impatient, she told him that if he was going to transform, he should hurry up already, because the longer he dragged it out, the more boring he became. So in the end, she decided to keep Ciro by her side and toy with him for a while. At the same time, she quietly waited for old man Ager's reaction, eager to see just how entertaining the chaos caused by Ciro might become. The scene shifted, and Ager was now sitting together with Magan. Beacon immediately noticed that there was no rank mark on Ager's neck, making him stand out sharply in a cell block where hierarchy was everything. When Beacon asked about it, the old man calmly explained that he had entered prison far too early, back when there had been no such rule as rank classification among prisoners. And once Beacon learned that this old man had not only survived for years in the dangerous regions of solitude, but had even fought the jungle natives alone, he instantly realized that the man's strength was likely far beyond ordinary understanding. So he quietly released a faint trace of killing intent, hoping to test Ager. But that thin strand of murderous aura, which even Magan failed to notice, was sensed by the old man in an instant. Even so, Ager's expression never changed in the slightest. Instead, it was Magan, sitting nearby, who suddenly felt a chill run through his bones and even wondered if he was just suffering from an empty stomach lately. But Ager's mind was still on Ciro, so he rose and left early. And as Beacon watched his back disappear, his wariness toward this seemingly ordinary old man only deepened, and he silently engraved the name Ager into his memory. Elsewhere, ever since returning to her own territory, Rosna had continued humiliating and torturing Ciro. She had beaten him until his entire body burned with pain, leaving him barely able to make sound. In the middle of that suffering, Ciro had even found himself briefly tempted to give in, thinking that if he just obeyed and became her pet, perhaps he would suffer less, and maybe, just maybe, he might live long enough to meet his lost older brother again. But just as he was about to sink fully into despair, one of Rosna's subordinates rushed in with urgent news, reporting that old man Ager had already arrived at the front of the territory with people behind him. The moment he heard that, hope reignited inside Ciro, and he was suddenly certain once again that he still had Ager to rely on. More importantly, the old man had not come alone this time. A large group had come with him, making for a formidable show of force. At the sight of this, Magan immediately shouted that Rosna was courting death. But Rosna remained just as arrogant as before and mocked Magan in return, calling him nothing more than an insect clinging to the old man's side. She even openly provoked him in front of everyone. The old man raised a hand to stop the hot-blooded Magan, his expression still calm, and simply demanded that Rosna release his friend Ciro immediately. But Rosna refused without hesitation, insisting that since Ciro had fallen into her hands, he now belonged to her, and she even turned it around by accusing the old man of failing to protect what was his. She went so far as to praise Ciro in a mocking tone, calling him a rare and adorable gem, and saying that she would never find such a perfect toy again. Ager only gave a cold laugh in response. He bluntly exposed the truth on the spot. Rosna had no idea what Ciro's real value was. Everything she had done had only been meant to lure him here. At the same time, he warned her in an utterly serious tone that if she insisted on keeping Ciro by her side, the only fate waiting for her would be death. But Rosna dismissed all of that as empty bluffing. Magan wanted to rush in and save Ciro, but once again the old man lifted a hand to stop him. because Ager already knew in his heart that Rosna had no way of truly killing Ciro. A mysterious figure had been watching from the shadows all along, which meant Ciro was absolutely safe for the time being. At that moment, Alice arrived to visit the old man. She had sensed the dense darkness hanging over this area and had come specifically to check on him, while also asking with concern about his physical condition. Ager admitted that his body had already deteriorated badly and that the time left to him truly was running out. Hearing that, Alice grew worried and offered to clean out the demon worshipper's servants inside the cell block for him. But the old man declined with polite firmness because Ciro, the one he needed to protect, was still inside the cell block. If they acted rashly, the boy would inevitably be caught in the fallout. Alice was deeply shocked. She had never imagined that anyone in this world could receive protection from the old man to such an extent. Before leaving, Alice made her stance clear. She said that she would always be ready to serve the old man and called him the most honored benefactor in her life. The old man could not help but feel a trace of emotion because he knew better than anyone that he was no longer the man he used to be. In the past, he had been someone who solved everything head-on. But now, all he could do was choose a more indirect path and lay out his plan step by step. Meanwhile, Rosna also found herself recalling that she had originally been nothing more than an ordinary third-level offender. It was only because some mysterious high-ranking existence had granted her power that she had slowly gained the status and influence she possessed now. But before she could bask in that pride for long, one of her subordinates came rushing over in panic with urgent news. In a single night, 40 of her people had died in a gruesome and mysterious way. And from the looks of it, their wounds had all been caused by some kind of cone-shaped weapon. Rosna was instantly thrown into shock because prisoners were supposed to be restrained by the anti-standing system. In theory, no one should have been capable of launching an attack while people were asleep. So she immediately decided that this had to be the work of the old man and his group. She stormed towards Ciro's cell in fury, only to find that it was already empty. Enraged, she immediately gathered what remained of her subordinates and charged toward the old man's quarters, shouting that she would avenge her dead men. But by that time, the old man had already quietly rescued Ciro and brought him back. After waking up, Ciro was filled with gratitude toward Ager, and he also made up his mind completely that he would become stronger and protect himself with his own strength. The next morning, just before the daily head count was about to begin, the old man brought Magan along and prepared to meet with began to discuss what came next. But at that very moment, Rosna arrived noisily with her people. The instant she saw the old man, she exploded into curses, accusing him of murdering her subordinates and taking Ciro away. She even swore that she would tear Ager to pieces. But the old man remained frighteningly calm the entire time. In fact, he only seemed annoyed by how loud Rosna was being. Then, right in front of the other two factions, he calmly proposed a brutal idea. Since Rosna had already lost so many subordinates, why not use this opportunity to hold a banquet and enslave the remaining 60 men under her command? At that moment, Rosna was seized by a terrible sense of foreboding. Magan and Becan, however, immediately understood how advantageous such a move would be for them. So they agreed on the spot, and the old balance, in which the three major factions had each controlled 100 people and kept one another in check, was shattered once and for all. Rosna's side had lost too much strength, and against the alliance of the other two factions, she no longer had even the slightest chance of winning. Only then did true fear finally swallow her whole. At last, she remembered the old man's earlier warning, and she understood that his prophecy of a dead end was about to come true. What followed was yet another bloody massacre inside the prison. And in the end, Rosna herself became nothing more than a meal for the others. At the same time, the lingering energy inside the cell began to gather together and eventually condensed into an aura spider. And because of one disturbance after another, the old man's scheduled meeting with the warden was delayed once again. At that moment, Dalkis began speaking to the old man from afar. Every word out of his mouth dripped with provocation. He even deliberately brought up the fact that his subordinate satyr had become half-witted after the old man forcibly severed his black magic connection. He even took the chance to question whether the old man was finally starting to feel fear. But the old man showed no sign of fear at all. With an icy tone, he simply replied that anyone who insisted on chasing him down and provoking him again and again would only end with one fate: death. As for Ciro, he had already changed so much that he was almost a different person now. He could clearly sense every subtle change in his surroundings, from the tiny insects crawling across the ground to the droplets of water quietly falling through the air. He could catch them all with clarity, and he realized that this was the sign of his wind attribute gradually awakening. Compared to a month ago, he had already grown several times stronger. Now, with nothing more than a flick of his fingers, he could easily stir the surrounding airflow. But even so, when facing the horrors, he still had no answer. He could not even truly break through their defenses. That made him remember what Grandpa Ager had once told him. Only by wielding an elemental force greater than the enemies could one truly defeat them. So he began thinking in silence about how to strengthen his wind attribute even further, deciding to patiently wait for Grandpa to teach him the real method. More than ever, he longed to become stronger. He did not want the day he reunited with his brother to come, only for him to still be nothing but a burden. But just then, the door to the cell was violently shoved open, and Zero instantly became alert. A level 6 prison guard named Taishi stepped in, dressed in a standard guard uniform, her face cold as she called out Ager's name in a voice full of unshakable authority. Zero was immediately filled with confusion. Why had this high-ranking guard, whose strength was clearly above even Sister Alice's, suddenly come looking for Grandpa? Meanwhile, Ager remained as calm as ever and slowly stepped out from the shadows. Taishi was clearly displeased with the way he appeared without making a sound. She let out a cold snort and bluntly stated who she was. Without the slightest courtesy, she declared that she had come to take Ager out of the cell. But Ager immediately refused, saying that he was feeling unwell and had no desire to change environments again. Then, in the next breath, he proposed something almost absurd. Taishi would fight Zero. If Taishi won, he would obediently go with her. But if Zero won, then he would remain here and continue resting quietly. Taishi found the proposal ridiculous and irritating, but when she remembered the warnings left to her by her seniors, she decided she could not be bothered to keep arguing with Ager and simply accepted the challenge, even though it looked completely one-sided. Her first move was sharp and ruthless, and she fully intended to subdue Zero in a single strike. What she had not expected was that this mere third-level boy would use his wind attribute to slip past her attacks with surprising agility. A flash of surprise crossed Taishi's eyes. She immediately guessed that Zero was probably a disciple Ager had deliberately been training. So she decided to use this fight to give him a proper lesson. When she attacked again, she clearly put far more force into it and directly cut through the wind blade Zero had condensed. Zero stared at Taishi's terrifyingly powerful control over the wind attribute, and his eyes naturally filled with longing and excitement. But that exact reaction only ended up completely angering Taishi. Zero hurriedly forced himself to focus with everything he had, trying to predict Taishi's next move in advance. But even then, he still could not sense her presence at all. In the very next second, he was struck hard and smashed straight to the ground. The pain spread through his whole body so violently that he could not even move. With a cold expression, Taishi declared that she had won the match. Ager only gave a calm nod and said that he would go with her. After Zero came back to his senses and saw that the two of them were already preparing to leave, he struggled desperately and asked where they were going. Ager merely pointed to the right and said there was somewhere he wanted to stop by first. Taishi was full of irritation, feeling that Ager was far too willful. But she was also worried that wasting any more time would cut into her rest. So in the end, she could only compromise. The three of them then arrived at a place that was both brightly lit and unusually noisy. Ager told Zero that this was a training hall where people could continuously temper themselves. In this place, the special environment could amplify his wind attribute several times over. He told Zero to continue training properly and said that he himself will be going somewhere else with Taishi, but would return to pick him up in 2 weeks. Zero instinctively clenched his fists and firmly promised that he would train with everything he had and never let Grandpa down. After that, Ager brought Zero to meet a 5th-level offender named Delamo. The moment they met, the man teased Ager for breaking his promise and even treating this place like some kind of daycare. Ager did not bother explaining much and instead proposed a deal directly. Delamo would train Zero, and in exchange, Ager would agree to duel him. Delamo had always been obsessed with fighting Ager head-on, so the moment he heard that, he immediately agreed and set the duel for gym number 94. Ager even specifically warned him not to say too much unnecessary nonsense to Zero, in case it interfered with the training. Then Ager gave Delamo a firm pat on the shoulder, signaling that Zero would now follow him and undergo harsh training. After that, Taishi took Ager to a solitary cell. This place was a nightmare to every prisoner. Most people who entered either fell to their knees and begged or suffered a total mental collapse. laughing like lunatics. And some even chose to end their own lives because they simply could not endure the endless darkness. But Ager remained unusually calm. It was almost as if this darkness itself was the home he knew best. He even politely thanked Taishi and told her she could leave now. Looking at how calm he was, Taishi was filled with confusion. This old man had clearly been pushed into a corner, yet he showed not the slightest panic. If anything, it felt like he had walked willingly into the darkness. But in the very next second, a hand suddenly shot out from the darkness, clamped over her mouth, and locked her in place. Taishi was instantly horrified. All she could think was that whatever was in the dark had truly gone insane, because attacking a level 6 guard was nothing less than asking to die. At that moment, inside the prison guard's lounge, level 6 guard Taishi was drenched in sweat. She sat there in the sauna, still muttering old man Ager's name under her breath. The moment she remembered how she had personally escorted Ager to solitary confinement, only to be restrained by him right after, she was overwhelmed with shock. One thought kept echoing in her head. What the hell was that? Had that old man gone insane? But Ager simply raised a hand, signaling for her to stay quiet. Then his gaze shifted toward the corridor ahead. Taishi followed his line of sight, and her face turned pale in an instant. Do you see it? That is one of the corridor's horrors. And that thing is monstrously huge. Taishi instinctively took a step back, her heart filling with lingering fear. She could not help wondering to herself if Ager had actually saved her from that horror just now. But almost immediately, a deeper confusion gripped her. She was wearing a protective charm made by the constellation of Light Order. By all logic, it should have suppressed a horror's aggression and kept it from coming near her. So why had that horror not only seen her clearly, but even launched an attack, while she herself had sensed nothing at all? Ager calmly explained that the creature was simply too powerful and had most likely malfunctioned. Horrors that were unaffected by the charm were rare, but not unheard of. Taishi was deeply shaken, because she had never once heard of such a thing as a malfunctioning horror. She had not been on the job very long, but even she had already heard plenty of eerie rumors surrounding Ager. At last, she could not hold back anymore and asked, "What exactly are you?" Ager only replied calmly that if she truly wanted the answer, she should go look for the clerk. Taishi's heart jolted, and the name Clerk Bemlio immediately surfaced in her mind. That was a 9th level prison guard whose identity was kept extremely secret. And yet this old man, who appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary 1st level inmate, somehow knew someone at that level. It was utterly unbelievable. Ager offered no further explanation, only saying that the clerk would naturally answer her questions. Then he urged Taishi to leave at once, saying that he still had other matters to handle. But the more he acted that way, the more curious Taishi became, and she secretly swore that she would uncover every secret Ager was hiding. Meanwhile, Ciro's training had already officially begun. During his very first session, his posture was completely wrong, yet his raw strength was astonishing. He had originally assumed that the torment Delamu spoke of would be some brutal form of torture, but to his surprise, it turned out to be nothing more than high-intensity physical training. The inmates in this prison seemed to have an almost obsessive fixation on working out. They were obsessed with perfect form and fanatical about pushing weight limits to the extreme. For a brief moment, Ciro even felt relieved, thinking that in a place like this, he could at least focus on building up his body. But that sense of relief vanished almost immediately, because the very next moment, he was suddenly ordered into a fight. The surrounding inmates immediately burst into discussion, all convinced that since Ciro had been brought here by Ager, there was no way he could be ordinary. Even so, he was still far too young, and in their eyes, even if he really was a beast man, he was just as likely to be beaten to death on the spot. To make matters worse, his opponent openly declared beforehand that he would take no responsibility for the outcome of the match. That opponent was Vincent, a 4th level offender and a boxer. Delamo even fanned the flames from the sidelines, urging Vincent to break all 4 of Ciro's limbs and beat him unconscious. He said it with complete confidence, insisting that Ager only ever trained merchandise worth hundreds of millions, and that even if someone like Ciro were seriously injured, he would recover quickly anyway. As the match officially began, everyone wanted to use this chance to see with their own eyes whether Ciro really was an ordinary beast man. And the moment the fight started, Ciro instantly completed his beast transformation. The entire place erupted in shock. Under normal circumstances, beastmen could not transform on their own until they were at least 20 years old. Delamo immediately concluded that Ager must have secretly taught Ciro some special method behind the scenes. The thought made him burn with envy. and he could not help grumbling that Ager would rather teach Zero than give him even a little real guidance. The two of them clashed almost immediately. Vincent came at him with savage force, attacking all out, and his movements were frighteningly fast. But in Zero's eyes, attacks like these were nowhere near as terrifying as the horrors he had faced in the corridor. Ager had already warned Zero long ago that using elemental power would steadily consume his life force. First, it drained physical stamina, then mental energy, and once both were exhausted, death would follow. Unless absolutely necessary, he was never supposed to use it carelessly. But this fight was only meant to test his strength, so while Zero held nothing back in his movement, he still treated it as a sparring trial and effortlessly slipped past every one of Vincent's attacks. Then, without the slightest hesitation, he released his wind attribute. Vincent was instantly shocked and enraged, finally realizing that the opponent in front of him was far more dangerous than he had imagined. In the end, Vincent was crushed completely, and everyone watching was left stunned by the outcome. After all, elemental power was supposed to be a skill only 5th level offenders could wield, yet Zero was merely a 3rd level offender. Even with Ager's guidance behind him, being able to do this much was already monstrous. The crowd began speculating that Ager must have some way of judging who was worth cultivating based on racial talent alone. But Delamu refused to accept it. In his mind, Zero had to possess some extraordinary trait that set him apart from everyone else. So he suddenly stepped forward and directly challenged Zero. Zero looked completely baffled, having no idea why the man was attacking so suddenly, and simply assumed this was just another strength test. But the moment Delamu's fist came crashing in, the sheer force behind it was horrifying. Only then did Zero truly understand just how terrifying a 5th level offender could be. And through it all, only one thought remained in his heart. If he could endure this trial, then he would take one more step toward becoming stronger, and one day he would no longer be a burden to his brother Lucas. But Zero's attacks at this point were still driven almost entirely by instinct. There was no real calculation behind them, no strategy at all, and because of that, nearly everything he threw out was blocked by Delamu with ease, until he was finally slammed to the ground and completely overpowered. After all, Delamu had already activated his Earth attribute, making his entire body feel like it was wrapped in an impenetrable tortoise shell. And at that moment, Delamu suddenly remembered something Ager had once said to him. Back then, Ager had told him plainly that yes, Delamu wanted to grow stronger, but because he was unable to move within the darkness, Ager could not teach him. At first, Delamu had assumed that the darkness simply referred to his own inner weakness, and so he dismissed the explanation as far too vague. But now, looking at Zero again, he had to admit that for a 3rd level offender, the boy was already performing exceptionally well, enough to be called qualified. Right at that moment, Zero, who had been retreating into his own inner darkness, seemed to figure something out and suddenly snapped awake. "Have you also gone through that training where you walk through the dark world?" he asked, unable to hold back the question. The moment Delamu heard that, he felt as if he had finally caught hold of a crucial thread. Zero saw there was no way around it now, so he ended up telling him about the meditation training method. He explained further that the reason he had grown stronger was precisely because of that special form of meditative training. And at the core of that training was the act of walking forward again and again through the darkness of one's own inner world. After hearing that, Delamu was almost completely convinced. He immediately realized that this was very likely Ager's personal training method. So he lowered himself on the spot and earnestly begged Zero to teach it to him. But Zero hesitated. He himself had only trained for a single month, and from the bottom of his heart, he felt he had no right to teach anyone else. More importantly, Ager had previously warned him in the most serious tone that guiding another person into the darkness of their inner world was extremely dangerous. The old man had even repeated again and again that this was something never to be attempted lightly. But Delamu's attitude was absolutely firm. No matter what, he wanted to learn this method that could make him stronger. In the end, Zero's heart softened. He also thought that Ager would not be coming back anytime soon. And since Delamu really was the one training him right now, revealing just a small part of the method probably would not cause any major trouble. So in the end, he agreed to Delamu's request. Delamu was overjoyed and immediately urged Zero to begin the training at once. Zero told him to close his eyes first, clear all distracting thoughts from his mind, and focus every bit of his attention on his breathing. As that deep breath sank in, the true meditation training finally began.